The Life of Blessed Henry Suso, Part 5. Chapter 34. Of the joys with which God recompenses in this present life those who suffer for him. On a joyful Easter day, the servitor was once in a blithesome mood, and, as he sat for a short time, according to his custom, in the repose of contemplation, he desired earnestly to hear from God what need of delights they shall receive from him in this life who have borne manifold sufferings for his sake. Whereupon, being wrapped in ecstasy, a light shone into his soul from God to this effect: Let all who suffer with detachment rejoice, for their patience shall be gloriously rewarded, and as they have been here below an object of pity to many, even so many rejoice eternally at the deserved praise and everlasting honor which shall be theirs. They have died with me, and they shall also rise again with me in gladness. 3 special gifts I will give them, so precious that no one can reckon up their value. First, I will give absolute power to their wishes in heaven and earth, so that whatever they wish shall come to pass. Secondly, I will give them my divine peace, which neither angel nor devil, nor man, nor any other creature can take away from them. Thirdly, I will so inwardly kiss them through and through, and so lovingly embrace them, that I in them and they in me, and we together, shall abide eternally, one undivided unity forever. And since long waiting and praying are painful to restless hearts, this love shall not be withheld from them during the short present hour of life, which lasts but for a moment, but shall begin even now, and be enjoyed internally, so far as man's mortal nature can in each case more or less support it. These glad tidings filled the servitor with joy, and when he came to himself again, he sprang up and began to laugh so heartily that the chapel in which he was re-echoed to the sound, and he said within himself joyously, Let him who has suffered come forward and complain. God knows I can declare that as to myself. Methinks I have never had anything at all to suffer. I know not what suffering is, but I know well what joy and bliss are. Power to wish and to obtain is given me, a thing which many erring hearts must be without. What more could I want? Then he turned his thoughts to the eternal truth and said, Ah, eternal truth, show me now this hidden mystery, so far as words can tell, for it is truth of which many blinded men are altogether ignorant. This mystery was inwardly manifested to him thus: Mark those who have paid due attention to the breaking away from creatures. In other words, to the death to self and all things with which a man must begin. Alas, there are not many such. The mind and thoughts of these men have so passed away into God that they know nothing, as it were, of themselves, save only that they view themselves and all things in their primal fountainhead, and therefore they have the same pleasure and complacency in each several thing which God does, as if God stood by unconcerned with it and inactive, and it were granted to them to carry out each thing according to their own mind, and thus it is that their will is absolute in might. For heaven and earth serve them, and every creature is subject to them, in what each does or leaves undone. Such persons feel no sorrow of heart about anything, For I only call that pain and sorrow of heart which the will, with full deliberation, wishes to be freed from. Externally, indeed, they have a sense of pleasure and pain, like other people, and it is more intense, perhaps, in them than others, because of their great tenderness. But in their inmost souls it finds no abiding place, and exteriorly they remain firm against impatience. They are filled to the full, even in this life, so far as this is possible, owing to their detachment from self, and hence their joy is complete and stable in all things. For the divine essence into which their hearts have passed away have become merged, that is, supposing they have not gone astray from the right path, neither pain nor sorrow finds place, but only peace and joy. If, however, thy own frailty entices thee to commit sin, from which pain and sorrow justly spring up for the sinner, and if thou committest sin, then, and then only, thou wilt find a flaw in thy happiness. But if thou avoidest sin, and goes out of thyself in this respect, and passest away in that in which thou canst have neither suffering nor sorrow, since pain is not pain to thee there, nor suffering suffering, but all things are unmingled peace, then it is well with thee in very truth. And all this comes to pass because their self-will is lost and gone. For the persons are of themselves driven onward with a longing thirst towards God's will and his justice, and they find such a sweet savor in God's will, and they so delight in it, and take pleasure in all that he ordains them, that they have no wish nor desire for anything else. This, however, must not be understood if they were forbidden to ask things of God and pray to him, for it is God's will that we pray to him. But it is to be understood of the due and rightful going forth of our own judgment into the will of the Supreme Godhead, as has been said. Now there lies in this a hidden difficulty, which many may stumble, and it is this. Who knows, they say, whether it is God's will? See now. God is a superessential good, and he is more interiorly present to every individual thing than that thing can be to itself. And against his will nothing can happen, nor can anything exist for an instant. Therefore they must be miserable who are always struggling against God's will, and desiring to do their own will, if they could. They have the kind of peace which is in hell, for they are always in sadness and heaviness. On the contrary, a soul stripped of self has God and peace at all times present to it, in adversity as well as in prosperity. For if he is truly there who does all and is all, how can the sight of their own sufferings be grievous to them, since in them they see God, find God, and make use of God's will, and know nothing of their own will? Not to speak of the consoling illuminations and heavenly device, with which God often secretly sustains his suffering friends. These persons are, as it were, in heaven. What happens to them, or does not happen to them, what God does in all creatures, or does not do, all turns to their advantage. And thus he who can bear suffering well receives in this world a portion of the reward of his sufferings, for he finds peace and joy in all things, and after death life everlasting awaits him. Chapter 35. Of the Servitor's Spiritual Daughter. Filia confide, be of good heart, daughter. Matthew 9:22. The servitor had at this time a spiritual daughter, of the Order of Friars Preachers in an enclosed convent at Tosse. Her name was Elizabeth Staglin, and she lived a very holy life exteriorly and was of angelic disposition within. The noble and energetic way in which she turned herself with her whole heart and soul to God set her free entirely from all those vain things which cause so many persons to neglect their eternal salvation. All her diligence was directed towards obtaining spiritual instruction, that she might be guided to a blessed and perfect life, the one end and object of all her wishes. She wrote down whatever she met with what pleased her, and seemed calculated to aid herself and others in the acquisition of divine virtues. And she acted in this like the industrious bees, which bring back sweet honey collected from many different flowers. In the convent where she lived among her sisters as a mirror of every virtue, she composed, notwithstanding her bodily infirmities, a large book, containing, among other things, an account of the blessed lives which the deceased holy sisters had led, and the great marvels God had wrought in them. It is a book well suited to excite good-hearted persons to devotion. This blessed daughter came to hear of the servitor of the eternal wisdom, and God inspired her with great devotion to his manner of life and teaching. She drew from him secretly the way in which he broke through created things to arrive at God, and she wrote it down, as has already related. At the first beginning of her conversion to God, she came across a great many deep intellectual views regarding the pure Godhead, the nothingness of all things, the detachment from self, abstraction of the mind from all sensible forms, and such like high things, and they were clothed in beautiful language, and were very pleasant to reflect upon. But there lay concealed beneath them something hurtful to simple-minded beginners like her, for she was quite ignorant of the necessary distinctions which ought to be made, inasmuch as the words were capable of being taken in a spiritual or natural sense, according to the disposition of those who used them. These doctrines were good in themselves, but they were insufficient for her instruction. She therefore wrote to the servitor, asking him to help her, and guide her along the right path. Nevertheless, as she has already tasted of the pleasure which is to be found in these doctrines, she prayed him to pass over the common ordinary kind of instruction and to write to her something about the above-mentioned high subjects. The servitor answered her thus: "Good daughter, if thou askest me concerning high things through curiosity, in order to become acquainted with them, to be able to talk well about spiritual matters, what have I to say to thee will need but few words. Take not too much pleasure in them, for they may easily lead thee into dangerous errors. True bliss lies not in beautiful words, but in good works. If, however, thou askest about these things in order to put them into practice, my answer is, let alone for the present these deep questions, and attend to those only which are suitable for thee. Thou seemest to me to be as yet a young unexercised sister, and therefore it will be more profitable to thee, and the like of thee, to hear about the first beginnings of the spiritual life, both how it ought to be begun, and what exercises are appropriate to it, and also about good and holy examples, as, for instance, how this and that friend of God, who began in the same way, first of all exercised themselves in imitating Christ's life and sufferings, what kind of things they had to suffer continually, how they bore themselves in their suffering interiorly and exteriorly, whether God drew them onwards by sweetness or by severity, and how they were set free from sensible forms and things. This is the way in which a beginner is spurred on and guided to perfection. For, though it is true that God can give all this to a person in an instant, it is not his way to do so, but it is to be obtained ordinarily only by hard labor and many conflicts. On receiving this letter, the daughter replied to him as follows: "What I long for is not wise words, but a holy life. And this I have courage truly and honestly to strive after until I attain it, whatever pain it may entail upon me, no matter what I may have to give up or suffer or die to, or whatever else may be needful to bring me to perfection. For all this I must and will undergo. And fear not on account of the weakness of my nature, for whatever you have the courage to command me, which is painful to nature, I have the courage to accomplish, with the help of God's might. Begin first with the lowest things, and guide me in them, just as a little school child is first taught what is adapted to its childish years, and then afterwards receive more and more instruction, until it becomes at last a master in the art. One only prayer I make to you, and this you must grant me for God's sakes, in order that I may not be instructed by you, but may also strengthened against all the trials which I have to encounter." He asked what this request might be. She answered, "Sir, I have heard say that the pelican is of such a nature that it bites itself, and from natural love feeds with its own blood of its young offspring in the nest. Sir, what I ask is, that you will act thus toward your needy child, and feed her with the spiritual food of your good teaching, and that you will not seek for this from afar, but take it from yourself. For the nearer it has been to you in the way of experience, the more deeply it will come home to my longing soul." The servitor wrote thus to her in answer: "Thou showest me a little while ago some high thoughts which thou hadst culled from the sweet teaching of the holy master Eckhart, which, as is just, thou valuedst highly. I marvel much that after thou hast drunk of the noble blood of this high master, thou declarest thyself so thirsty for the coarse drink of the lowly servitor. Nevertheless, when I consider it well, I note with joy thy great wisdom in this matter, and that thou art so busy in thy questioning that what is the first beginning of a high and secure nature, and what are the exercises which must first practiced in order to attain it." Chapter 36. Of the First Beginnings of a Beginner. "The beginnings of a holy life," said the servitor to the daughter, "are various. One person begins in one way and another in another. But as regards the beginning, to which your questions refer, I will tell you about it. I know a man in Christ who, when he began to give himself to God, first cleared out his conscience by a general confession, and he spared no pains to make this confession well, by exposing every sin that he had committed to a prudent confessor, in order that he might go pure and clean from the confessor, who sits in God's place, and that all his sins might be forgiven him, as happened to Mary Magdalene, when, with penitent heart and tearful eyes, she watched Christ's feet, and God forgave her all her sins. Such was the first beginning of this man's turning to God. The daughter laid this example very much to heart, and she wished to lose no time in imitating it, and she conceived a great desire to make her confession to the servitor, thinking that it would be the one best suited for her, and it was her intention also, in doing this, to become thereby his spiritual daughter, and so to have a great claim upon his godly care. Now it happened that the confession could not be made by word of mouth. She therefore passed in review her entire life, which, in very truth, had been a pure and innocent one, and whatever sins it seemed to her that she had committed, she wrote down on a large waxen tablet, which she then fastened up and sent to him, begging him to pronounce absolution over her sins. When he read through the confession, he came to the following words at the bottom of the tablet: "Gracious sir, I, a sinful creature, fall down now at your feet and beseech you, with your true and faithful heart, to bring me back again into God's heart, to let me be called your child in time and in eternity." The daughter's confiding devotion touched him very much, and, turning to God, he said, "Merciful God, what answer is thy servitor to make to this? Shall I drive her from me? I should not like to treat a dog thus. O Lord, if I did this, it might reflect ill upon thee, my Lord and Master. For she seeks the Lord's wealth in his servant. O gentle Lord, I cast myself at thy holy feet, and beseech thee, kind Lord, to hear her. Let her have the benefit of her good faith and hearty confidence, for she cries after us. How didst thou treat the heathen woman? Ah, kind heart, see how far and wide thy fame of thy unfathomable bountifulness has spread among us. O kindly goodness, turn thy gentle eyes towards her, and say to her one single little word of consolation. Say then, Confide filia, fides tua se salvam fecit. Be of good heart, daughter, thy faith has saved thee. And bring thou it to pass in my stead, for I have done what rests with me, and I have wished her a full absolution from all her sins. He wrote back the following answer to her by the same messenger. What thou hast asked of God through the servitor has come to pass, and thou must know that it was all shown to him by God beforehand. Early this very morning, when his prayer was ended, he sat down for a brief moment of repose, and his bodily senses being stilled in ecstasy, many divine mysteries were manifested to him. Among other things, he was enlightened to understand how God made this delivery of form to be the individualizing principle of the angelic nature, and has given to each angel a special property which distinguishes him from the rest, all which is impossible for him to express in words. After he had spent a good space of time in heavenly recreation with his angelic spirits, and was in very joyous mood through the exceeding wonderment which his soul had felt, it seemed to him, in the same vision, that thou didst come in and stand before him, where he sat amongst the heavenly company, and then, kneeling down with great earnestness in front of him, didst bow thy face upon his heart, and continue kneeling thus with thy face bowed upon his heart, so that the angels who stood by beheld it. The brother marveled at thy boldness, and yet thy bearing was so holy that he graciously permitted it. What manner of graces the Heavenly Father bestowed on thee, While thou wert bowed down upon the suffering heart, thou knowest right well, and they were visible upon thee. For when, after a good while, thou didst raise up thyself, thy countenance was so joyful and full of grace, that it was quite evident God had bestowed some special grace upon thee. And he will do still more for thee through the same heart, that he may be glorified in it, and thus consoled. The like happened also to a maiden named Anna, a noble and godly person, who dwelt in a castle, and who, moreover, led a life of pure, unmingled suffering. God wrought great marvels in her from her youth up to her death. Before she knew the servitor or had ever heard of him, she was one day wrapped in ecstasy at her devotions, and she saw how the saints gaze upon and praise God in the court of heaven. Upon this she prayed her dear apostle St. John, to whom she had a special devotion, to hear her confession. He answered her very lovingly, "I will give thee a good confessor in my place. God has granted him full authority over thee, and he can comfort thee well in thy manifold sufferings." She asked who and where he was, and what was his name, all of which St. John made known to her. She thanked God, and, rising early in the morning, went to the monastery which God had shown her, and asked for him. He came to her at the outer gate, and inquired of what her business was. Upon this she made her confession to him, and when he heard the heavenly message, he consented and fulfilled it. This holy daughter also told him that she had once seen in spirit a beautiful rose tree, richly adorned with red roses, and on the rose tree there appeared the little child Jesus with a garland of red roses. Beneath the rose tree she saw the servitor sitting. The little child broke off many of the roses and threw them upon the servitor, so that he became all covered and bestrewed with roses. Upon this she asked the child what the roses meant, and he answered, "The great quantity of roses signifies the manifold sufferings which God will send him, and which he must lovingly accept at God's hands, and bear with patience." Chapter 37. Of the first lessons and examples which are suitable for a beginner, and how he should regulate his exercises with discretion. At the first beginning of the servitor's interior life, after he had purified his soul properly by confession, he marked out for himself, in thought, 3 circles, within which he shut himself up, as in a spiritual entrenchment. The first circle was his cell, his chapel, and the choir. When he was within this circle, he seemed to commit himself in complete security. The second circle was the whole monastery as far as the outer gate. The third and outermost circle was the gate, and here it was necessary for him to stand well upon his guard. When he went outside these 3 circles, it seemed to him that he was in the plight of some wild animal which is outside its hole, surrounded by the hunt, and therefore in need of all its cunning and watchfulness. He had, moreover, in his beginnings, made choice of a chapel as a place of retirement, in which he might satisfy his devotion by means of pictures. Now it should be observed that, in his youth, he had caused to be painted for himself, upon parchment, a picture of the eternal wisdom, who rules supreme over heaven and earth, and far surpasses all created things in ravishing beauty and loveliness of form, for which reason, when he was in the bloom of youth, he had chosen wisdom for his beloved. He carried this lovely picture with him when he journeyed to the place of studies, and he always set it before him in the window of his cell, and used to look at it lovingly with heartfelt longings. He brought it back home with him on his return, and caused it to be transferred to his chapel wall as a token of affection. What other kinds of symbolical representations were there, bearing upon the interior life, and adapted to himself and other beginners, may be learned from the pictures and sayings of the ancient fathers painted on the walls. As part of these sayings, translated into the vulgar tongue, follows below, exactly as they were inscribed upon the chapel. The ancient father Arsenius asked the angel what he must do to be saved. The angel answered, "Thou must flee, and be silent and sit still." Afterwards, in a vision, the angel read these words to the servitor out of the book of the ancient fathers: "A wellspring of all bliss is to keep thyself quiet and in solitude." Abbot Theodore: "To keep thyself pure and spotless will advance thee more in knowledge than study will." Abbot Moses: "Sit in thy cell, it will teach thee all things." Abbot John: "Keep thy outward man still, and thy inward man pure." The same: "A fish out of water and a monk out of his monastery will equally come to grief." Anthony: "Bodily mortification, interior devotion, and seclusion from men beget chastity." The same: "Wear no garment in which vanity can be discerned. The first battle of a beginner is boldly to resist sins." The Shepherd: "Be wroth with no one until he tries to pluck out thy right eye." Isidore: "A wrathful man is displeasing to God, however great may be the miracles which he works." In Parachaeus: "It is a less sin to eat meat when one should have avoided than to backbite thy neighbor." Pior: "It is very wicked to bring forward the sins of others and to keep back our own." Zachary: "A man must suffer great humiliations if he is to arrive at perfection." Nestor: "Thou must first become an ass, if thou wouldst possess heavenly wisdom." An Ancient: "Thou shouldst be immovable in weal and woe, like one dead." Elias: "A pale complexion, a wasted body, and a lowly bearing beseem well a spiritual man." Hilarion: "A wanton horse and an unchaste body should have their provender cut down." An Ancient: "Take away from me wine, for the death of the soul lies hidden in it." The Shepherd: "He who still complains and cannot keep from anger and much talking will never become a spiritual man." Cassian: "As the dying Christ bore himself upon the cross, so should our manner of life be fashioned." Anthony said to a brother, "O man, help thyself, otherwise neither God nor I will ever help thee." A woman besought the ancient father Arsenius to remember her before God. He answered, "I pray God to blot out thy image from my heart." Macarius: "I inflict many hardships on my body, because I have many temptations from it." John the father said, I have never done my own will, and I never taught anything in words which had not first practiced in deeds. An ancient. Many words without deeds are vain, like the tree which bears many leaves but no fruit. Nihilus. He who must have much intercourse with the world must needs to receive many wounds. An ancient. If thou canst do nothing else, keep guard at least over thyself for God. Imperachius. He who keeps himself chaste will be honored here and crowned by God hereafter. Apollonius. Resist beginnings and stop the serpent by the head. Agathon. I have carried a stone in my mouth for 3 years, that I might learn silence. Arsenius. I have often repented of having spoken, but never of having kept silence. An ancient father was asked by a disciple how long he should keep silence. The father answered, "Until thou art asked a question." Saint Syncletica. If thou art sick, rejoice thereat, for God has been mindful of thee. The same. If thou art sick, do not ascribe it to thy fasts, for those who fall sick do not fast. The same. If thou art tried by temptations of the flesh, rejoice, for thou mayest become a second Paul. Nestor, a good brother, said, "The sun never shone upon me eating." Another, called John, added, "Nor upon me angry." Anthony, the greatest virtue is to be able to observe moderation in all things. Paphnutius, it is no use to begin well until thou dost carry it through to a good end. Abbot Moses, avoid whatever would deprive thee of thy soul, however good it may appear. Cassian, the term of all perfection is attained when the soul, with all its powers, is gathered up into one object, God. The servitor sent these examples and sayings of the ancient fathers to his spiritual daughter, who drank them all in, and applied them to herself, as though he had meant her also to exercise her body with severe chastisement, after the austere fashion of the ancient fathers. And she began accordingly to mortify and torment herself with hair shirts and cords and cruel bands set round with sharp iron nails, and many other such like instruments of penance. But when the servitor became aware of this, he wrote to her as follows: "Dear daughter, if thy purpose is to order thy spiritual life according to my teaching, as was thy request to me, cease from all such austerities, for they suit not the weakness of thy sex and thy well-ordered frame." The dear Jesus did not say, "Take my cross upon you," but he said to each, "Take up thy cross." Thou shouldst not seek to imitate the austerity of the ancient fathers, nor the severe exercises of thy spiritual father. Thou shouldst only take for thyself a portion of them, such as thou canst practice easily with thy infirm body, to the end that sin may die in thee, and yet thy bodily life may not be shortened. This is a very excellent exercise, and the best of all for thee. She wished to know from him why he himself had practiced such great austerities, and yet would not advise her or others to practice them. Upon this he referred her to the holy writings, saying, It is written that, in former times, some amongst the ancient fathers led a life of such superhuman and incredible austerity that the very mention of it is a horror to certain delicate persons of the present day. For they know not what burning devotion can enable a man, by the divine aid, to do and suffer for God. The one who is filled with such fervor finds all impossible things become possible of accomplishment in God, just as David says, with the help of God, he could go through a wall. Psalms 17:30. It is also written in the book of the ancient fathers that some of them did not treat themselves with great austerity, as others did, and yet they were all striving to reach the same end. St. Peter and John had not the same training. Who can fully explain this marvel, unless it be that the Lord, who is wonderful in his saints, wills, by reason of his high sovereignty, to be glorified in many different ways. Besides this, our natures are not all alike, and what is suitable to one suits not another. Therefore it must not be thought that, if perchance a man had not practiced such great austerities, he will thereby hindered from arriving at perfection. At the same time, those who are soft and delicate should not despise austerities in others, or judge them harshly. Let each look to himself and see what God wants of him, and attend to this, leaving all else alone. Speaking generally, it is much better to be moderate rather than immoderate in the practice of austerities. But as the mean is hard to find, it is wiser to keep a little under it than to venture high above it. For it often happens that, if a man mortifies his bodily frame to excess, he will have afterwards to indulge it to excess. Though certainly many great saints have forgotten themselves in this point through the fervor of their devotion, such austerity of life, and the examples which have been mentioned, may be of use to those who are too tender with themselves, and to their own injury give too much rein to their rebellious bodies. But this concerns not thee, nor the like of thee. God has many kinds of crosses with which he chastens his friends. I look for him to lay another sort of cross upon thy shoulders, which will be far more painful to thee than these austerities. Accept this cross with patience when it comes to thee. Not long afterwards, God afflicted the servitor's spiritual daughter with a long and weary illness, so that she continued sickly in body until her death. She sent him word that it had come to pass with her as he had predicted, upon which he wrote in answer thus: Dear daughter, God has not only afflicted thee according to my words, but he has also wounded me and thee. For I have now no one left who will help me with the same diligence and godly faithfulness to complete my little book, as then didst when thou wert well. Therefore the servitor besought God earnestly on thy behalf, that it might be his good will to give thee back thy health. And when God would not forthwith hearken to his prayer, he was angered against him with a loving anger, and was minded that he could write no more books about the faithful God, and would likewise leave off his usual morning greeting through ill humor, unless God made thee well again. Now when he had sat down in the disquiet of his heart, according to custom, in his chapel, his senses were absorbed in ecstasy, and it seemed to him that a company of angels came before him in the chapel, and sang to comfort him a heavenly song, because they knew that at that time he was in a peculiar sorrow, And they asked him why he looked so sad and did not sing with them. When he told them how he had behaved in his excess to the dear God, because he would not hearken to his prayer for thy recovery, and they counseled him to desist from it, and not act thus, for that God had ordained his sickness for the best, and would be thy cross in this world, and through it thou wouldst earn a great grace here, and manifold reward in heaven. Therefore be patient, my daughter, and receive it simply as a loving gift from the faithful God.